I'm glad I get the ovation before I speak. That sort of takes off some of the pressure. So I'm very pleased to be here to represent the Pfizer Rare Disease Group, many of whom are actually in the audience and I think ready to heckle me if I do say something that's not quite correct. So we should all be ready for that. I think everybody sitting in this room knows that there are just a small number of patients impacted by any single rare disease. But collectively, the need is huge. Millions of patients are impacted. And yet less than 5% of the 6,000 to 8,000 diseases have anything that is close to an approved therapy. As a pediatric nephrologist, you can say that I've been in rare disease for a very long time. In fact, my very first publication was for Galloway-Mowat syndrome. And if there's anybody here, even you experts in rare disease who knows what that is, I do have a prize for you. Anybody? No, it's an autosomal recessive form of congenital nephrotic syndrome associated with microcephaly. So although I did see a few patients with enuresis or bedwetting and the occasional recurrent UTI, mostly my practice was filled with patients with rare disease who had no alternatives for therapy. So as you know, Pfizer has a strong foundation in rare diseases with over a decade of experience and 22 therapies already on the market. And that's something that Frida covered with you this morning. Discovering and developing new treatments for rare disease is core to our mission. As one of the largest biopharmaceutical companies in the world, we bring a lot to bear. We have discovery scientists with years of expertise. We have clinical and medical experts with a deep knowledge of clinical development. We have regulatory relationships that we can leverage in this space. And we have a seat at the table in discussion of global policies to advance the development of rare diseases, of therapies for rare diseases. But our trajectory is too slow. Even though Pfizer is not alone, and many other companies have entered this space trying to advance therapies for patients with rare and orphan diseases, I think you can see that 500 years is too long to get to them all. We need to do something to change this trajectory. So, Pfizer researchers are working internally and alongside external partners to develop a robust pipeline with preclinical and clinical assets to address these rare diseases. We have 4 high priority areas that are hematology, neurology, pulmonology, and metabolic diseases. And we are focusing our expertise within these areas. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I'm most comfortable speaking about, which is the diseases and their patients. Pfizer has a long history in hemophilia. It's a rare bleeding disorder that occurs because of a genetic defect that leads to a malfunctioning clotting factor, a clotting factor that's significant in the cascade of events that would normally prevent bleeding from very minor trauma, bleeding internally, bleeding into the joints, bleeding into the central nervous system. 2 of these therapies, Xintha and Benefix, have benefited patients with hemophilia A and B respectively. And this is actually a really good example of how science and the pharmaceutical industry have evolved together to serve the needs of patients with severe disease. Now, because I've taught you about Xintha and Benefix, you're going to have to look for a couple moments at some very important prescribing and safety information. Now, leveraging Pfizer's experience in hemophilia, we have continued our development efforts in this space. And that includes both a factor VIIa that would serve patients who've created antibody inhibitors to their current therapies, work on extended half-life for factor VIII that would decrease the frequency of necessary infusions for prophylaxis, as well as an anti-tissue factor pathway inhibitor that would be an alternative to clotting factor replacement in hemophilia, or would be a treatment for other bleeding disorders. Now, you heard Frida talk to you a little bit about sickle cell disease. Pfizer has an ongoing collaboration with Glycomimetics for a clinical development compound that is moving forward for vaso-occlusive crisis. And sickle cell disease is actually very interesting because for more than 50 years, we've known that a single amino acid substitution is responsible for an abnormal hemoglobin protein. And that abnormal hemoglobin protein causes sickling of an otherwise normal red blood cell. And that sickling causes vaso-occlusion, causes ischemia, organ damage, and ultimately even organ death and mortality. So for 50 years we've known this. And I can't answer to you why it is that in the emergency room today, as Frida said, it's the exact same therapy that it was when I entered pediatric residency in the 80s. That's hydration and narcotics. Hopefully the collaboration with GMI will give new hope and new alternatives to patients with these extremely painful vaso-occlusive crises. Cystic fibrosis is another area of concentration for Pfizer. And this is a disease, as also we heard a little bit about earlier today, that is caused by a mutation in an ion channel that allows for the buildup of abnormally thick mucus in the lungs and the digestive system. Patients present with recurrent lung infections. They have ongoing pulmonary insufficiency, malabsorption, failure to thrive. There has been better supportive care for patients with cystic fibrosis over the years, and this has made a big difference. That difference is that you don't die in your teens anymore. Now you die in your 30s. There are a small number of patients who are lucky enough that have Kalydeco available to them that will make a huge difference with respect to their prognosis and outcome. But that's just a small number of patients that are currently served. Now, you'll have to forgive me because I do like to get a little personal and say that I am born and raised in Montreal, and some of you may know that there's actually somewhat of a founder effect for cystic fibrosis in Quebec. When I did my pediatric residency there, you didn't know it was a rare disease because it occurred with an increased incidence and frequency in French Canadians as compared to other parts of the world. And even in my own class, in elementary school, there were twin boys who had cystic fibrosis, who became good friends of mine, and my recollection as a child is that that's because they were short and I was short, and that was an instant bond, even though I didn't have cystic fibrosis. And again, you'll have to forgive me because I can't even practice this without getting a little wobbly in the voice, but it hits home when instead of celebrating the indignities of middle age, we go to memorials for them as they passed away about 10 years ago. So Pfizer and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation Therapeutics have actually created an active research partnership to expedite the delivery of products for these patients in need. Pfizer brings to the table a huge library of over 5 million chemical compounds to use for screening, as well as the technical and scientific staff to work on this program. CFFT brings a deep knowledge of the disease and its impact on patients. They also bring a global network of experts and financial support to make sure that we can see this through to fruition. I'm also going to touch briefly on Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which is in clinical development in the Rare Disease Research Unit at Pfizer. Duchenne's is an X-linked disease affecting the production of dystrophin, which is a protein key to muscle function. It presents in young boys, usually around the age of 6. It starts with clumsiness and abnormal gait, and these boys generally become wheelchair-bound in their early teens. They then have progressive dysfunction and cardiac and respiratory failure, generally die as young men. Currently, there's no approved disease-modifying therapy. And it's partly through our active relationship with advocacy organizations that we've been able to move this clinical program further along. Lymphangioleiomyomatosis is a rare disease that affects women in their childbearing years. And Pfizer's interaction with the advocacy organization and patients with LAM is a little bit different in that we didn't have an internal program moving forward for LAM, but we did support a very dedicated and devoted scientist in advancing therapies. This is a good example of a collaboration where a scientist recognized that LAM, which is related to a mutation in the gene TSC1, TSC2 that's associated with tuberous sclerosis, noted that Pfizer had an internal compound that affected signal transduction from the protein output of TSC1 and TSC2, and put together a multi-center trial that Pfizer was able to support for patients with this disease. This was a very important trial that had very exciting results that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And you'll forgive me for not giving you more details about this, because if I did, then you probably have about 5 slides worth of fair balance prescribing information. So unfortunately, I do have to be a little bit vague, but Eugene Sullivan gave an excellent talk about the LAM Foundation and this work. So if you have any further questions about it, you can certainly see him with regard to it. And last, I'm going to touch on TTR, transthyretin amyloidoses. Transthyretin amyloidoses are diseases of protein misfolding. TTR itself is what's called a tetramer. So it's a protein that's actually made of 4 identical subunits. And those 4 identical subunits in that form bound together are benign, but they can dissociate. And the individual oligomer itself, or subunit, then can misfold, aggregate, and create amyloid. Now, if you have a mutation in the gene that codes for that subunit, then your TTR subunit is more likely to dissociate. It becomes unstable in the tetrameric form. And dissociated means that you have more misfolding and more amyloid formation. And depending on where that mutation is, that dissociation and deposition of amyloid can occur either in the neural tissue or in the cardiac tissue. When it occurs in the neural tissue, it's TTR-FAP, or familial amyloid polyneuropathy. Familial amyloid polyneuropathy occurs in patients between the ages of 30 and 40, and it is a progressive neurological disease with wasting that's quite severe, and patients generally die about 10 to 15 years following diagnosis. In cardiomyopathy, if that's where the mutation defect lies and it deposits in the cardiac tissue, you develop congestive heart failure. And it's generally in males, appearing usually between the ages of 60 and 70, and patients die relatively rapidly in 3 to 5 years. Devastating diseases. Pfizer currently has an approved product in Europe for TTR-FAP, and we're working now globally on further development programs for both TTR-FAP and cardiomyopathy to serve these patients globally. So I hope that you've gotten a small snapshot of the workings of the Pfizer rare disease research and business units, and that you can see that we have a commitment to bringing forward therapies for patients with rare disease. But we can't do this alone, and we recognize that we can't do this alone. The Pfizer team is ready to work together with you, with regulators, with industry partners, with academia, with patient advocacy organizations, payers, government policymakers, in order to see this through. We recognize its importance. We're committed to it. We put the resources behind it, and we hope that we can work together for success. Thanks very much, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them for you.